with to come up with remarks and questions. So that to our webinar, my name is Rasmus Andresen. I'm a member of the European Parliament for the Greens. I'm coordinating the Greens EFA group in the European Parliament in the Budget Committee. And I've been a member of the Parliament's negotiation team for the long-term budget for the next 7 years. And as you all, I guess, are aware of, we had been through some intense months in the Parliament, but also in the other European institutions, negotiating the long-term budget for the next 7 years, but also negotiating the recovery package, the response from the European Union on the COVID crisis with an amount of 750 billion euro. You have, I guess, all followed the meeting of the European Council of the state leaders in back in July, and afterwards we had many months of negotiations in the Parliament on the different elements, like the rule of law, like the European budget for the next 7 years, and the recovery package. Even the recovery package, so the 750 billion, the question about what kind of criteria are important for the payment of this package to the member states are negotiated right now. So some of the colleagues are sitting in these days and negotiating it with the member states. So this has been a long process, and this is a long process. And after we finished at least the rule of law proposal and the European long-term budget proposal some weeks ago, we all thought, okay, this is it, and we were all quite satisfied with the compromises we made. And it seems like there would have been a broad majority in the Parliament for the proposals, but also through the member states. And now we are in the situation that 2 member states, Poland and Hungary, has decided to block the European budget. Not because they dislike the budget proposal or the compromises and we made in the European budget, but they dislike the proposal of the rule of law, which actually means that we will in future will link the payments of the European budget to the state of play, the current situation on the rule of law in the member states. And some member states, Poland and Hungary, are opposing. And because of the procedure we are facing in the European institutions, they are blocking the budget because they can't block the other proposal. This is the case because on the rule of law issue, we are in the situation that the majority of the member states and the majority in the Parliament can decide together that this should become law, and that we need a link between the budget and our common European values. On the other side, on the recovery instrument and on the European budget, there is unanimity in the Council, which means that each member state needs to vote in favor for the compromise, and or on the other side, if not every member state is voting in favor, 1 member state or even 2 member states can block the proposal. And this is the case right now, and this is what we would like to discuss. Next week, the state leaders will meet. They need to find a common solution, a compromise, because everything should start at the beginning of January. But how is the situation now? How is also the situation in Poland and Hungary? Why are the governments doing this, and why? But also, how is the economic situation and other elements in the regarding member states, and what kind of ways do we have related to the European budget and the recovery instrument to to go ahead, even if the council next week maybe won't find an agreement. This is what we would like to discuss tonight with our experts, and I'm happy that we were able in having a so interesting panel like the one we are having here tonight. And I would like to explain to you who is with me here on the panel tonight. First of all, Edith Zgut. Hopefully I'm pronouncing your name correctly. If not, you have to correct me afterwards. You are a political analyst. You are a fellow from the German Marshall Fund and Visegrad Insight, and you are a lecturer at the University in Warsaw. And first of all, welcome and thanks that you are with us here tonight. Then with us is Katalin Halmai. You are a journalist, Hungarian journalist, I can say, working as a Brussels correspondent in you will give us a lot of interesting insights, I guess, on the situation both in Hungary, but also among the power play between Hungary and the European Union. And maybe you can explain a little bit to the audience and to me how Viktor Orban and the Hungarian government is acting and what we have to expect in the next weeks. And the third one on the panel is Lucas Guttenberg. You are the Deputy Director of the Jacques Delors Institute in Berlin, working especially and a lot on economic issues, also regarding to the recovery instrument and the European budget. You have come up with a lot of studies also in the last months, and you will give us your perspective also, I guess, on the economic situation and maybe also possible ways out of this crisis. We will start with some inputs from all of our three experts, and afterwards we will discuss the questions I've raised in my introductory statement. So you can all participate. So it's not like I will ask the question and our experts will answer. If you have some questions or if you would like to come with remarks on the different elements, then please feel free to do so. You can raise your hand here in the Zoom call. I guess many of you had used Zoom a lot in the past months, and you know how this is working. Or you can also use the function, the chat function, so that you can ask some questions if you don't want to speak, but if you would like to get an answer on some of the elements. But first of all, we will start with Edith and your input. So once again, thanks and welcome to you, and you will have the floor now.
Thank you, Rasmus, and thanks for the invitation. I'm really delighted to be here. So if I may, let me just very briefly unpack the different motivations behind the Polish and Hungarian governments and how are, so two countries which are the main beneficiaries of the EU funds, and they are furthest into autocracy within the EU. Let me start with Poland. Like, I think in Poland, Poland is largely concerned with defending its overhaul of the judiciary, while the junior coalition partner Zbigniew Ziobro is exploiting the crisis further, trying to consolidate power. So he keeps pushing the ruling Law and Justice Party to maintain this veto that you just mentioned. And I think this is mainly a symbolic power struggle fight for the Polish government, as this watered down conditionality in its current format would, I think, hardly prevent PIS from completing the judiciary overhaul at the end of the day anyway. And I think the Polish government fairly knows that it will eventually come at a very huge financial cost, and at a more cost of political isolation at the end of the day. And this is exactly what could hound them, the government domestically, that is already in a downfall because of the abortion issue and this cultural fight that they picked recently. So also, I think recent poll shows that Polish society remains very much pro-European, so quite supportive and against also towards this rule of law conditionality and EU funds, quite divided the society is. But taking all these factors into account, I think we can fairly say that the negotiating position of the Polish government is quite shaky at best. In contrast to that, Mr. Orban, he's been playing a lot more aggressive poker since he could really get away with undermining democratic institutions, and he could enrich his informal clientelistic network for 10 years within the EU. But now he has a broader set of concerns regarding the rule of law conditionality, including this blatant misuse of the EU funds and the selective law enforcement regarding the systemic corruption. And because there's a huge discrepancy between what the government is saying, what they're trying to embed into this Eurosceptic populist rhetoric, and what the economic reality of the country is. So although the Hungarian prime minister keeps claiming that Brussels is plotting to colonize Hungary, the EU funding accounts for 3–4% of the Hungarian GDP, and the primary source of EU funds are the sort of the target of state corruption. So the reality is that Hungary is becoming increasingly dependent on EU funds. 49% of the public procurement was co-financed by EU transferred in the last 10 years. And the economy, most importantly, is now facing an unprecedented economic downturn due to COVID. And while Viktor Orban is threatening with veto, the Hungarian authorities already started to submit applications for their programs under the Recovery Fund last week. I think it's quite telling. So what we see is that he's trying to cement his clientelistic ecosystem for the long run and to secure power in case mismanagement of COVID would result in an election defeat in 2 years, because we're going to have general elections in 2022. And this is why the Hungarian government is trying to water down the conditionality as much as possible, trying to narrow its scope and implement deferral clause to the Hungarian government to tie it up to the European Court of Justice, because this type of litigation would likely to take long lasting, and the regime would be still able to use the EU funds during the upcoming parliamentary campaign. So what we see is that the logic of the Hungarian government, this modus operandi, with what we've witnessed in the last 10 years, it's changing. It's in a change. Instead of making these symbolic concessions for the EU and moving forward with small strategic steps, most likely it's over. And right now what we see is that they're just decided a full front attack. So what we have witnessed in the last couple of weeks was the end of his famous cat and mouse game, making one step forward and making 2 steps back. And I think from a strategic perspective, we can say that maintaining this Eurosceptic fight, this long-lasting fight against the EU, it usually makes sense on a domestic level, because it is exploiting anti-establishment sentiments among Viktor Orban's core voters. And now it diverts a lot of attention from the government's poor performance managing the second wave of the pandemic. But I think that both the Polish and the Hungarian government made a huge strategic mistake by pushing this envelope, despite that there might have not even any kind of political intention to use this conditionality against them. So after this, they pushed it very aggressively. What we see is that they might have just infuriated and united the EU as a whole. And as far as I know, Slovenia is still on the fence. But otherwise, there seems to be a united front in the making against these 2 veto type of attempts. And I think the normal court of justice, a normal court of action, would have been to address their reservations to the European Court of Justice instead of threatening the whole EU and trying to hijack the budget negotiations with the veto. And Hungary did this regarding the mandatory relocation system, and also Poland followed this path regarding the posted workers. But if they fail to do so, I think it's quite telling that this type of if they don't do this with the conditionality mechanism, I guess they are just lacking faith in the strength of their own argument for sure. So that's what I wanted to say at the very beginning, and I'm very happy to respond to all questions that you have as a follow-up. Thank you.
Thank you, Katalin.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Hello, everybody. I would like to talk a little bit about why the Orban government acting like this. What is the current state of play? I don't think that anybody can be surprised by the behavior of the Orban government. It has never been a supporter of the steps the EU has taken to strengthen the rule of law. And we all know why. Because this government has been trying to undermine the rule of law and democratic checks and balances since 2010. Whatever the Commission has come up, be it a proposal for a rule of law dialogue, a rule of law report, launching Article 7 procedure, the Hungarian government was always against it. It would accept only the so-called peer review in the Council, which would have no consequences and would go nowhere. So the Orban government is very much against the rule of law conditionality as well, because it would hurt it where it is the most painful for him, and this is money. The Council would be able to impose financial sanctions if a member state undermines the Union's financial interests because of breaches of the rule of law. In other words, if public authorities are unable or do not want to prevent, investigate, or prosecute high-level corruption or fraud and irregularities committed by pro-government businessmen, which is very much the case in Hungary, then the Union can step in and decide about sanctions. This is what Fidesz wants to avoid and is afraid of. This is also the reason why Hungary didn't join the European Prosecutor's Office. But the official reasoning is always very legalistic. Of course, Hungary is in favor of the rule of law, the government says, but we don't like the text, they say, which is vague, circumvents the treaties and provides no legal remedies to the member states concerned. Therefore, the Hungarian and Polish governments want to renegotiate the regulation and start a dialogue on it next year. Only then they will adopt the 1.8 billion financial package. And this is also the reason why they are threatening to veto it. The future of the EU budget and the recovery fund is in the hands of the German presidency now. It is in the hands of Angela Merkel. And according to the latest information, both sides stick to its position and don't want to make any concessions, while the Chancellor wants them to compromise. As to the Hungarian government's position, I really do not know whether Prime Minister Orban would be ready to compromise and give in. What I am quite sure is that he is not bluffing. He is not that kind of person who is bluffing very often. And I think he also relies on Prime Minister Morawiecki because he knows that Poland is much, much more important for Germany and for the European Union than Hungary. So remember the joint communique where they promised to each other not to conclude separate agreements. And there is also a growing pressure on these two countries to fold. We hear messages from Brussels about the so-called bridge solutions without these two countries and plans to start a provisional budget next year. But I think we have to wait until the next European Council meeting to know whether there is a way out of this crisis. Thank you very much. That was all what I wanted to say for the time being.
Thank you, Lucas.
Thanks a lot, and thanks a lot, Rasmus, for the invitation. Maybe just a few points on how we got to this situation in the first place. So I think we should remember that this whole debate about the EU long-term budget has been going on for like 2 years. It is like a drama we have every 7 years in the EU, and I think until February, March, it went very much like everyone suspected. All the countries, because it's a unanimity dossier, so all countries have to agree in the end, basically fought for their own interests. But then with the debate on the recovery fund, it's got all spiced up a bit, and it became clear relatively early on with this legal construction that was chosen that individual countries who would hold out would get a lot of leverage, or would be able to exploit that to some extent. And that is why I think it's important to remember that already in the summer, Poland and Hungary got quite substantial concessions in the negotiations. That is true economically. So the countries got quite a big share in the allocation of the recovery fund. Especially Poland had a fairly mild first wave and a pretty reduced recession, and nevertheless they got a pretty big chunk of the recovery money. And the same is true to some extent for Hungary. And also in the agreement that was found in July, the rule of law mechanism that was proposed by the Commission was already downsized substantially. So it's not like the countries claim now that nobody listened to them or that it was like all against them from the start, but I think there was a lot of goodwill on the part of the other member states to bring them on board, also because everyone knew that it's a unanimity dossier and that we would need all countries to agree. I think the agreement that was found in July at the summit was a typical European compromise in the sense that there were a lot of good elements, like the recovery fund that was pretty historic, a lot of bad elements. I would say the compromise they found at the time on the MFF, so on the long-term budget, was pretty disappointing. And also the rule of law conditionality was a lot weaker than I think a lot of us would have hoped for. But that's how compromises in Europe are. And I think and everybody agreed to that. And I think what is important to remember is that already then there was a sentence in the Council conclusions that said there should be a regime to protect the EU budget in connection with rule of law. And both Orban and Morawiecki signed that thing. So the claims now that this is all like against the treaty, this is not what we signed up to, this was not what we could have expected, that is just a blatant lie. That was already clear in the summer that there would be some form of mechanism. The question was about the details. And these details were then negotiated with the EP. And I think also that was to be expected, that there would be some room to move towards the European Parliament on the mechanism. But I think it's pretty clear that what is now the final compromise on the rule of law mechanism is squarely within what was in the Council conclusions in the summer. Namely, it is a mechanism that is linked really, really closely to the EU budget, and where the Council has to agree with qualified majority to any sanction. And so I'm not really sure how I can square the agreement of Orban and Morawiecki in the summer to this language in the conclusions and their position now, which basically says nothing ever will be possible without treaty change. So I think that's something to keep in mind when we assess a bit their positions. The question is a bit what do we do with this veto now? And I think there's a big temptation now to try out all kinds of alternative solutions. I think the best strategy is still from the European side to stay calm. I think the whole threat of the veto works because Orban and Morawiecki project this idea that they have a lot of leverage and that they can basically scare everyone. And I think they have a lot to lose economically and politically. And I think both Katalin and Edith already alluded to that. We have pretty much united front to 25-2. The Slovenian prime minister sometimes says he supports it, but then his ambassador never follows suit and basically is still with the 24 others when it comes to negotiations in Brussels. And I think if we can learn one thing from European history is that when you really get isolated in the EU, then you have you make yourself a long-term problem. And I think also economically, if we don't have a budget as of the 1st of January, that means neither the Hungarian nor the Polish government can distribute any new money. And I think we have also heard some chatter in the last days from the EU Commission that also old payments, so payments that these countries would still get from the old MFF, would be cut down pretty sizably if there is no budget. And so I think economically also these governments will feel it pretty fast if the whole package doesn't make it over the finish line. And I think it's good that the Commission now has prepared some alternatives just in case, but I think the goal should still be to really stay calm and to try to get this agreement over the finish line as it is. I think it's a good package. It's a package that is also fulfilling the first time that we do something as EU, as 27. I think it would be bad to build like separate structures now again after the Brits have left, and we for the first time have the possibility to build these things in the EU as a whole. And also, I think ultimately it would be unfair to the citizens in Poland and in Hungary if they couldn't benefit from European solidarity, because it's not like entirely their fault that we have these governments there. So I think to sum up, I still have some hope that we get an agreement next week, also because I think it should be in the national interest even of these two governments that they are risking a lot. I think both the European Parliament and the German presidency should make it clear that without any deal on the recovery fund, on the MFF, on the rule of law mechanism, there will be no new money for these for these countries as of 1st of January. And I think both the presidency and the EP could communicate that even clearer. But then, yeah, as I said, I'm still hopeful that we get some form of agreement. And I'm now looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Lucas. I mean, it's good to have some positive energy there, because my feeling is, talking to a lot of people in the parliament, but also in the council, in the German government, there are a lot of pessimism out there when it comes to these kind of questions. But still, of course, we are all hoping for that there will be a solution, and not a weakened rule of law solution, because this is of course something, at least also in the German context, many fear. And before I will take the first questions and the first remarks from the audience, I would like to ask one question, because in many of the states, and I'm mainly following the discussion in Brussels, in Germany, and in the Nordic countries, there is a quite tough public opinion on the rule of law, and also on the question of how to deal with that right now, and not to compromise, for example, with Poland and Hungary, and to stick to the line. But on the other side, I would like to ask, how is the debate in Poland and in Hungary? I saw the Polish Prime Minister today coming out in a German newspaper, the FAZ, speaking to the German public, at least explaining that this is a fight for sovereignty, and the German citizens should understand the Polish government much better than maybe some other people in the European Union because of German history. And so there is something about this sovereignty issue, I guess, especially also in the context of Hungary and Poland. And I would like to ask you, Edith and Katalin, on how is the debate in Poland and in Hungary? I know you have insights in both of the countries, but maybe Edith, you could start with Poland, and Katalin could tell us a little bit more about Hungary.
Okay. Thank you, Rasmus. If I may, before I get to that specific question, let me just briefly reflect upon what Lucas has said about that there is still a slight chance to make an agreement, because I would like to join that type of cautious optimism. Perhaps not next week, but maybe at the beginning of next year. I think there might be a window of opportunity for that, because obviously there is a huge growing pressure on these two countries to drop their veto by pushing an intergovernmental treaty idea on the recovery fund, as it has been just mentioned. And as far as I see, this Friends of Rule of Law group might right now just have sort of an upper hand now, and Merkel might not be able to make any significant concessions to Orban and Morawiecki, as it was hinted before. So at the end of the day, I assume that Hungary and Poland are most likely just close a deal on the rule of law with some sort of symbolic compromise, like with some sort of cosmetic amendments that both governments could bring home as a huge victory, because this is practically what's happening all the time. They're making an agreement, even if they're making concessions, they're going home, they're like capitals, and they're announcing a victory. So, you know, what could be in store, like, I don't know, emphasizing impartiality and legal remedies in the European Court of Justice, or other ideas might be also in store, like emergency brake, to implement some sort of emergency brake to allow a country to kick the issue up to the EU leaders, which is, I don't think, a major concession, because this is already foreseen in this rule of law regulation anyway. And it's, I mean, overall, I think it's not hard to guess for whom it's more important to get a deal as soon as possible. Net beneficiary countries like Poland and Hungary, or net contributors as the rest of them, most of the rest of them. So, and I think also another contributing factor is that the German presidency would also need to present some sort of an outcome as a success, because it's about to come to an end, the presidency itself. And not to mention the fact that like the intergovernmental treaty option, I think in the long run, that will be something which could be like a quite difficult road to go down the road, with a lot of administrative issues and difficulties. And I guess the money wouldn't even be able to get to the southern countries, not even by the end of the next year. But you perhaps could provide some more insights on that from the Budget Commission. And speaking about how these issues are being depicted in our countries, yeah, there is no trick here. As Lucas just mentioned, Hungary and Poland was absolutely, like, the government were aware of the fact that this issue is going to be dealt with within the council, and it's going to be dealt with qualified majority. So there is no trick here. But I think it's worth to have a look at the broader context of the Eurosceptic political discourse in these countries. And what we have been witnessing in the last 5-10 years is that anti-establishment sentiments have been fully exploited by these two governments in these countries. So they were trying to direct this anti-establishment frustrations towards internal and external enemies, and Mr. Orban and both Jarosław Kaczynski, the informal leader of Poland, they have been enforcing this type of, you know, like broader narratives and conspiracy theories about migration, mainly in Hungary. This is quite one-dimensional. Viktor Orban is falsely claiming that rule of law criticism is a pretext to attack Hungary because of its anti-immigrant stance. And I think if to put it into a broader European context, the main difference between, for instance, Viktor Orban, Jarosław Kaczynski and Western populists like Matteo Salvini is that there is a very strong anti-imperialist connotation in Poland and Hungary. So Kaczynski and Orban are accusing Western Europe and these countries that they are harboring colonialist sentiments towards Central Europe, and they are trying to exploit and undermine these countries, and also to willing to exploit them culturally, economically, and politically. And it was a lot more robust in Hungary. Katalin could also provide some insight about like what sort of robust campaigns have been launched by the Hungarian government, anti-EU government, about conspiracy theories, how Brussels is willing to undermine the will of the Hungarian people in cooperation with George Soros. So it was embedded into even broader conspiracy theory that the EU and George Soros is trying to replace Hungarian population with Muslims. I mean, that's the central narrative, and this is the pretext which is being used against all the rule of law criticism which is coming from the Western countries. And I think it's worth highlighting that it actually had an impact on the public attitudes in these countries, that despite the fact that we have one of the most pro-EU societies in Poland and Hungary, recent polls in the last couple of years have shown that public attitudes are slightly changing, saying that, for instance, in 2017, one poll showed that more Hungarian respondents claim that they're afraid of Russia as a geopolitic risk less than they fear that they're afraid of Brussels and George Soros. But also Poland is rapidly shifting towards the same direction. This year, an early spring poll showed that the number of respondents claiming that Poland would do better outside of the EU has increased by 11 percentage point in 2 years. And I think this is something which would need to take very seriously by the EU itself as well.
Thank you, Katalin.
Yes, I will be a bit shorter. According to the latest poll made by the European Parliament, we've seen that 72% of Hungarians support the rule of law conditionality. And this is a big deal because because the government propaganda says day and night that that the European Union wants to humiliate Hungarians and Brussels wants to colonize Hungary, and the rule of law tool is nothing else than a tool in the hands of Brussels to undermine, as Edith said, the will of the Hungarian people. On the other hand, I have to say that I think many Hungarians support the EU position and wants the European Union to stick to its position and don't give in, not to give in Viktor Orbán's government, because sometimes people feel that they are helpless. They cannot do anything because you know, the whole Orbán regime prevents them from changing the system in a democratic way, and some of them expect the European Union to do something because they feel that they cannot do anything against this regime.
Thank you, and I can support that. I mean, I'm, as member of the European Parliament, I think my work is to represent all European citizens. I mean, I'm elected in Germany, but this is what my deepest belief is, that this is what our mandate is about. And I get a lot of emails, not so many from Hungary, but especially from Poland, and especially also from minority communities, actually pushing for strong support from the European Union, a strong rule of law mechanism, but also other kind of support, because many of them are saying that this is crucial also for the development in their countries. I would like to give the floor to the who had raised their hand to ask some questions or to come with some remarks. We also received some questions in the chat or in the written system. So I would also include these questions, but they are more on the budgetary perspective. So I would like to take them up a little bit later, but just to give the information to the ones asking, that we will not forget you and your questions, but I will put them up later. But first of all, the first on the list is Gerald Heinkes, and afterwards Uwe Pütter, and then I will take the panel again.
Hello, good evening. Thanks for giving me the floor. Honestly spoken, I'm a little bit fed up with the institutions, with all three institutions, because we see since more than 10 years such a great appeasement politic to corrupt politicians. We can start with Berlusconi, in Italian with Aznar, in Spain we have now Kaczynski and Orban, we have the corrupt politicians in Malta, we have them in Slovenia, in Slovakia. And so I think that has to stop, because the European Union itself has lost a lot of its credibility, because that is not a case just for 1 year or 2 years, but it's about 10 years ago that they have not really spoken for the rule of law. And my question is also to the panel: who cares about these corrupt politicians if they put a veto on the table? You have the possibility with enhanced cooperation to circumvent these vetoes. And to Rasmus, why is the European Parliament not putting the first rule of law proposal on the table again, with a majority which only with a 2/3 majority could circumvent the Strafen, there was a first proposal with the other majority to circumvent you know what I mean.
Yeah, the qualified and reverse qualified majority.
Qualified majority that the council needed a qualified majority to vote against. And I think with you, if you can try to do it with the enhanced cooperation, put the first proposal on the table again, you will have supporters from Austria, from the Netherlands, from the Scandinavian countries to get this first proposal through again. So I really urge you to be bold and to go really in hard terms also to Ursula von der Leyen and the EPP fraction, because they have, especially Merkel, has always supported the corrupt Orban and Fidesz party. So I think once in the crisis 2012, there was an article from Helmut Schmidt in the Welt, and he proposed and he urged the European Parliament to try a putsch. I don't ask you to putsch it, but you should stay strong. You should really fight. Try to have, we have now a corona crisis, use this crisis to top it with an institutional crisis, because a crisis is, it's a very special Greek word. So a crisis is necessary to do it or to break it. They have to change on which side they are on. And that is what I ask you, especially from the European Parliament, if you don't want to lose credibility. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Gerald. I will take it up in some seconds, but first of all, Uwe Pütter.
Many thanks. Many thanks to all the speakers and for letting me slip in this session here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm an academic. I'm a professor at Europa University in Flensburg, and I spent 15 years before that in Budapest at the Central European University. So I know a little bit the country background. I have a question first to Rasmus Andresen as a politician in the negotiations between the European Parliament and of course you were involved also with the German Council presidency. And then I would turn to the analysts who spoke before, because we heard from, I think, all the three panelists so far the reasons why things could change. I'm just wondering, we heard one thing, or you didn't talk about one thing at all, and this is the rule of law mechanism itself. My question to Rasmus Andresen as one of the stakeholders in that process is, do you have any confidence in this mechanism? In other words, knowing what's going on in Poland and Hungary, I think it's not necessary to repeat this. If you would have confidence in that mechanism, which you decided, and it's a compromise, obviously, it's tied to the budget, then shouldn't we expect that actually this mechanism would be used at some point? Perhaps it's even more likely now that it's used than if it would have been a sort of more broadly defined, and it could have been used in a much broader way. But thinking about using it in a very concrete way, where we have issues with spending going into or funds being allocated in the wrong way and so on and so forth, having this discussion about independence of judiciary, public administration and so on and so forth. It's not so difficult to imagine that something could come up with that. So my question, first of all, do you have any confidence in that mechanism that it would do so? And if it was the case that it actually could bite, wouldn't it change a little bit the equation for Orban and then also the Morawiecki, in a sense that perhaps you have a little bit more to lose here than we so far discussed? Or is it totally irrelevant, which then would work more in the direction of what Lucas said, that actually we shouldn't bother too much about it, because at some point you want to take out the money, so you will agree. That's my big puzzle here. So if for Poland and Hungary, leaving all the other reasons they have to veto this aside, there is a real concern that actually some of the money wouldn't come their way because of that mechanism, then of course the incentive to hold out a little longer here might be higher. Of course, considering all the other reasons they have for doing so. That's my question.
Thanks, Uwe. I would like to give one more the floor, and then afterwards I will go back to the panel. But Walter Jansen, you were sending a message that you would like to come with some remarks. Please, we have not so much time, so it would be great if you would limit your all a bit to the most important element, and then because then we can take more questions and we will have time for the answer. But now, Walter, please, now it's your turn. You need to turn on your mic. You're muted, we can't hear you.
So you hear me now? Yes.
Yes.
So I will certainly be very short. I am a citizen of the German community in Belgium, and I have a few questions concerning, in fact, the future of all this. I do know, in some extent, Gerald told a few points which I could definitely sign on. As to our two guests, Katalin and Edith, I'm asking that there is certainly a kind of optimism in their speech, that they say, yes, the population is majority pro-European. I mean, the election results do not show this. And if you are now waiting for the next elections, this could be the same, like, for instance, in the United States. We were not expecting Trump to get 50% of the votes, but he nearly got 50% of the votes. So I'm not sure where the population in those two countries is. Maybe you can elaborate a little on that. The other point is that I agree. I would not, how to say, I would really have a hard stand now in the European Parliament. I'm asking Rasmus, is the Parliament going to change the opinion and finally let a kind of compromise go through, or will they stay hard and say no, we are not going to move on? I think we are discussing 5, 7, 10 years already now, the whole thing. And I'm also a little tired of hearing every time that the EU started a procedure against Hungary or started a procedure against Poland, but we don't hear of any result of those procedures. The procedure started already, I think, 3, 4 years ago. So what will be the result of those procedures? Thank you.
Thanks, Walter. And now I would like to go back to the panel. I think there are a lot of elements, so I would like to have a comment from all of you. And of course, some of the questions were raised to me, so I will, of course, also answer. But I would like to start with, I don't know, Katalin, maybe?
Before I start replying the questions, let me tell you that I just received the news that the Polish government representative said, according to Reuters, that Poland will drop its veto if he receives a legal declaration from the European Commission that the mechanism can be activated only in connection with the budget and will be an objective conditionality. So it is, if it is true, that is the good news for today, and maybe we can see the end of the tunnel now. And I would like to reply to the last question about the popularity of the European Union and the elections. So the elections in Hungary and in Poland and I think in many other countries are not about the European Union. So no matter how the European Union popular or whatever in Hungary, people supporting the membership, they do not vote for this or for another party because of the European Union itself. And let me also emphasize that the Orbán government never says that it wants to leave the European Union. Orbán himself is very careful to formulate his position, and he always says that Hungary doesn't want to leave the European Union. He basically wants to change the European Union. He doesn't want to leave it, as he wants to change possibly the European People's Party and the members of this political family. So I think this was one of the questions. What are the others? I don't remember which one were addressed to us.
Well, I think it's
intergovernmental solution, right? That was,
yes. On the question of you could the institutions could come up with the old rule of law proposal and vote on it without Hungary and Poland, and then try to come up with the enhanced cooperation. I don't know if you would like to comment on that, then please go ahead. If not, maybe the others can take that up. Would you like to?
So I think there are many options on the table now, but I don't think that anybody, and we are talking about the institutions now, I don't think that any of the European institutions wants Poland or Hungary to leave aside. Not at this moment. That is my feeling. So we hear a lot of messages about intergovernmental cooperation, enhanced cooperation. We hear news about setting up a special financial vehicle to start the next generation, or the recovery fund rather, but I don't think these are serious statements from the side of the European Commission or from the EU Council at the moment. I think they are messages to these two countries that just think it over, drop your veto, we agree with the package, and then afterwards we will somehow settle or disputes. So at the moment, I think everybody is focusing in Brussels, at least, on the plan A and not on plan B. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Katalin. Lucas.
Yeah, thanks. Just also to give a bit more context to this quote, I think it came from Gowin, who's the deputy PM, and he was like very much in the center of the Polish coalition. So at the minimum, that signals to us that in the Polish coalition there is something going on. And I think he has a very interesting quote, which is contrary to some voices in the Polish in Poland, a provisional budget would not be good for us. So I think that threat seems to start to bite in the Polish internal debate. I would just like to take up the question of we'll put on the rule of law mechanism. I think the interesting thing about this mechanism is that it has the potential to be used. So I think it creates an opportunity for the Commission to act on certain rule of law matters, not all, but some, where you can really say, if you, for example, don't have an independent judiciary, then this is a problem for the way you use EU funds. And I think there will be a burden of proof which will be fairly heavy on the Commission to show that link. But the formulation that the Parliament also got in there, which also covers risks to the use of EU fund and not just the actual use of it, I think it gives an opportunity. The problem is, will there be the political will? And that goes to also the question that that came earlier, which is like, why didn't the institutions do anything? I think the problem is that there isn't a political will among member states to sanction this kinds of behavior so far. And the same has been true to some extent for the Commission. And I think the question is now, do we get a majority of member states willing to push ahead with that? And does the Commission take this up and make this a priority? And I think on that front, I would also be not so keen on this question of reverse qualified majority or qualified majority. This is a political question. Is this a priority? And I think the Commission needs to have the support of the member states who support this principle, which in principle should be all. And so we build this mechanism as a door, but the Commission has to go through this door and the member states have to support that. And I think that will be the very interesting question in the next years, whether this will be taken up. And on the calculation, I mean, I think there is a real risk for these governments if they do certain rule of law breaches to lose money under this mechanism if it's used. But of course, there's also a real pretty big risk for them to lose money just because of the veto itself. And I would say potentially that loss is far, far greater than they would ever be losing from the mechanism, which makes it, I think, in the end, a pretty irrational behavior on their part or a bluff. And I think we can't exclude either of those. I think both governments are not particularly rational at the moment, but in terms of just the pure loss function, I think what they can lose in the mechanism dwarfs compared to what they can lose if they don't get access to the recovery fund money.
Edith.
Thanks. If I may just very briefly respond to the raised questions. First, regarding the question raised by Uwe Puter and the rule of law conditionality, let me just, I couldn't agree more with Lucas that it has a potential, but it mainly depends on political will. And I think this is the bottom line here. And I briefly touched upon this during my introductory remarks, but I think this would be the worst case scenario if anyone would make any type of further concessions, like weakening this mechanism, because it is already, in my opinion, it's already too weak. Despite the efforts of the European Parliament, which was, I think, picking up a fight to enforce it as sort of effective as possible, it has been significantly watered down during the German presidency. And just to highlight one element, and I think this is really crucial from a practical point of view, in order to use this tool, the EU Commission would need to prove that the member state, and I'm quoting here, seriously risk affecting the principles of the sound financial management of the EU budget or the protection of the financial interests of the EU in a sufficiently direct way. So I think in a deeply legalized environment like the European Union, it's very important to use a clear wording. And this is absolutely not clear. And this is a crucial point, that since serious risk and sufficiently direct way are completely vague, so the danger is that without political will, which is the bottom line, the process might just result in another never-ending political stalemate, like what we witnessed with Article 7 procedure. And icing on the cake is that the conditionality mechanism itself does not even cover broader rule of law challenges. For instance, curbing the fundamental rights or amending the electoral bill, for instance, which is just happening in Hungary, or the freedom of the press. So from the strategical point of view of Viktor Orbán and Jaroslav Kaczynski, I think they could have just simply take it and accept it as a quite good deal for them, potentially without any political consequences in the long run. Regarding the intergovernmental risks, I think any type of intergovernmental treaty could be put together quite fast, rapidly, especially in-house cooperation. But I think these are extraordinary times, and perhaps we cannot operate business as usual, and circumventing Poland and Hungary would be deeply problematic. not to mention that there would be many legal and technical hurdles that I just mentioned while going down this road, like the ratification issue, for instance. So we have to remember that all EU member states, the EU budget and the own resources platform requires parliamentary ratification. Some countries would also want to renegotiate a couple of elements, perhaps, from this July deal. And I'm afraid that the intergovernmental route could be messy and could really take time, and it's highly unlikely that the core elements of the original deal could unravel, and that South would really suffocating to not to have access to this money by the end of the next year. And just really a very brief note on what has been said about the social preconditions and how our societies are dealing with being pro-European and electing very Eurosceptic governments at the same time. I would just like to quote one of the most famous political Hungarian thinker here, István Bibó, who said that democracy in Central and Eastern Europe has been always hunted by historical traumas. And I think this is exactly why the Hungarian government is keep pushing this, this narrative of the imperialist West trying to invade and trying to undermine our type of sovereignty, that you also raised this issue, Rasmus. So I think this is how it works in practice, that we can have the cake and eat it too. That might be the way of thinking of the Hungarian government, that they're pushing a very Eurosceptic envelope, and at the same time, they're just, like not really coming up with any explicit idea of like launch a let's leave the European Union campaign, because it's enough to exploit anti-establishment sentiments, which is happening with the help of this type of anti-colonialist narrative that I just highlighted before. Thank you.
Thank you. I can really recommend on this again the interview with Morawiecki in the German newspaper FAZ today, because it's quite interesting also from an analytical point of view. I was asked the question also about the rule of law and the question of if I have confidence in the mechanism, and I would answer a bit in a way like Lucas already did. It depends a lot on what the Commission actually is doing with the mechanism, and at least our evaluation of the negotiations there and what our people also working on the rule of law mechanism are saying, and I fully agree with them, is that at least this is a step in the right direction. It's not what we wanted as Parliament. It's not even what we would have chosen if the Greens would have a majority in the Council and in the European Parliament. But it's a step in the right direction, and it could be used from the Commission, and then we could have another event about if we think that the Commission, the European Commission, would do that or not, and if there is more support needed from the member states, so that maybe the commissioner in charge of that is working on it and will use it in a way that we would like to see it. This is quite an interesting question, but at least as mechanism, it's a step in the right direction and it could be used. Of course, also on the question of why not go back to the old proposal and decide on it with a majority. There I also fully agree with our experts here on the panel. This is not what the member states did. This is not what the council was interested in. And there we also have to mention that the German presidency, but also the Frugals, very outspoken in public, like Mark Rutte, for example, from the Netherlands. They are very vocal about the rule of law. But when it comes to the negotiations in the council, then they are preferring to fight for rebates and other issues related to the budget. And then they are not prioritizing the fight for a strong rule of law mechanism. This is what we have seen back in July at the European Council, where it took 3 or 4 days discussing how much grants and loans the recovery instrument should be filled with, how many rebates the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden Germany should get. And at the end, they had not much time to discuss the rule of law or issues like climate or other issues related to the budget. And if we would have had a better proposal from the council, if, for example, Mark Rutte and others would have taken the fight there, then maybe also the agreement, and Merkel, of course, also the agreement would have been better, and then there would have been more possibilities also for the European Parliament afterwards in the negotiations to change that and make the proposal even better. But this was not the situation. At the end, it was just the Parliament and our colleagues in the negotiations there fighting for that we at least are having a rule of law mechanism we can use and we can develop in the next years. And this is basically what we had tried to do there. But it's confident if I can have confidence also in the European Commission. And of course, this is a very complicated topic, but at least it's important to decide on it right now. But it's also important not to compromise any further on it, because as you all were saying, there are some problems also related to the mechanism already now. And if we would weaken it much more, then of course it would be useless. And this is why I think that also the Parliament, and not just the Greens, but a majority in the Parliament of the pro-European groups are quite vocal on this. And you can, for example, also see the EPP also in their internal discussions they are having. The rule of law means now more for them than maybe it would have done else. So there is also dynamics there where I can't see the Parliament compromising on this element further, but let's look on it later next week how the development will be. I would like to go to the more economic and budget questions related to the compromises. There have also been some questions about that in the chat, and of course this is a little bit the other side of the discussion. But at the beginning of a big economic crisis, this is also very important, and there has been a lot of questions also regarding the question what would happen if there is no agreement next week in the European Council. I mean, the situation right now is that we have an overall agreement. We had finalized the negotiations on the 7 years budget. We are close to have a deal on the recovery facility. There are still some open issues left. But still there is a possibility, a chance to have that in place so that we can vote on it in the plenary in December. And on the other side, and there is also the annual budget negotiations going on right now, where there is a deadline coming up next Monday. And I don't want to tell too much, but I can tell you that it seems that there will be also a compromise on this part, so that there maybe in the next days or hours could be an agreement related to the budget 21, which would be the first budget in the new MFF period. But this can just be in place if there is an overall agreement. And now the question is, what kind of possibilities are there if there is no overall agreement on the MFF next week in the European Council? And I don't know, Lucas, if you would like to comment on this. We are also having a question on what would that actually mean, for example, also for programs like the research program Horizon or the Erasmus program or other programs. And I guess you can answer this question.
Yeah, so I think we are then in a pretty unprecedented situation, because it would mean we have no long-term EU budget. We also would have no new so-called own resources decision, which means the EU would rely on its old source for funding. We would have no new budget for the next year. And that would mean two things immediately. One is that all the spending programs that the EU has, for example, the Cohesion Fund, Horizon Europe, Erasmus, and so on, expire by the end of the year. and barring an agreement by Council and Parliament would not be prolonged, which would mean that as of 1st of January, there would be no new EU money. What we still would have is old EU money. So basically commitments that the EU has taken in the past 7 years for, say, a bridge that is built somewhere, that is being built now. And of course, the money that has been promised also will still flow in a so-called provisional budget, which without a full EU budget for the next year would mean that every month we have 1/12 of the last year's budget that can be spent, but with an important caveat, because the UK has left, and because the old own resources decision has a fairly low payment ceiling, so the amount of money that member states maximally will give to Brussels to fund the EU budget is lower than would be needed to cover the expenses for next year. We have a shortfall. So even the money that has been promised from the EU will not be fully paid in the next year because there is a gap in the amount of money that the EU can get. And that is the situation, I think, that also the Polish Deputy Prime Minister was now referring to, that can be very unbeneficial, especially for the big net receiving countries like Poland and Hungary. It would also mean that all the rebates that the Netherlands and Denmark and Sweden and Austria have negotiated for them would not take force, but every country would just pay the same share of this provisional budget. And we would have still to find a solution for the recovery instrument, which is supposed to start to pay out in July. But for that, I would say we would still have a bit of time. But that is the situation that we would be in if there is no deal on the weekend, on the end of next week.
Thank you. I can see some more questions in the chat coming up, for example, on the Free City initiative put forward by the mayors of Budapest and Warsaw and some other cities, I guess, as well, where they actually are also calling for, the mayors of the cities are calling for direct support, direct funding from the European budget, also for the cities and the regions, and from the perspective of the European Parliament and the Greens, I can tell you that we have also called for that, because for us it's not just about to sanction the governments, but it's also to have a more direct possibility to found cities, regions, and also NGOs, for example, when it comes to democracy work, for example. And I know that on the recovery facility, for example, we are also calling for to spend 10% of the money, or to reserve 10% of the money of the recovery facility going to the member states for the regions, so that there will be direct funding for regions. This could also be the case not just in Poland or Hungary. This is also interesting in a German context, for example, that not Olaf Scholz is spending all the money for the measures the German government is coming up with, but that the Bundesländer, for example, or the municipalities would get some funding there. Or, for example, in Spain, I know this is a big issue also related to Barcelona and other cities. I would like to ask Katalin and Edith about if this call from the mayors of Budapest and Warsaw got some response in the public in Hungary and in Poland, and yeah, what do you think about this? Would this help to have, for example, now in the negotiations on the recovery facility, yeah, a mechanism like that, so that we would get more funding, direct funding for cities and regions, also in countries like Poland and Hungary? I don't know, Edith, maybe you will start and then Katalin afterwards.
Okay, so yes, when it comes to Poland, like decentralization in general and the importance of local autonomies, it's one of the most important sort of historical achievement of the democratic transition. So I think that the support towards this type of initiatives is in generally high. And as far as I know, like in general, the financial space to maneuver for local governance when it comes to EU funds might be a little slightly bigger. But I think in Hungary, what makes things complicated is that the government is systematically trying to restrict has been restricting local autonomies in the last 10 years. So local municipality wouldn't have that much of, I mean, it's uncomparable to the Polish structure, of course. It's completely top-down, centralized, and under the pretext of COVID, the government have been just trying to further restrict local municipalities financially and politically. So I think it's a little bit more difficult here, despite whether there is support within the society or not. And let me just use this opportunity to briefly touch upon what could be in the long run some sort of a solution to do something about this type of autocratic system building and how to prevent further democratic backsliding in these countries, because what we witnessed in the last 10 years is that Viktor Orbán have become a master of formally complying with the rules while informally and substantially undermining democracy, and so on and so forth. So he plays this type of dirty claim in a very deeply legalized environment, the European Union, where the EU institutions are mainly based on transparency and accountability and cautiously avoiding harsh language and punishment, direct punishment towards its own member states. I think it's quite obvious from what didn't happen in the European Council so far with the Article 7 procedure. So what we witnessed is that these instruments like Article 7 and the rule of law conditionality would typically target specific violations of the EU law, not to mention that the scope of the rule of law conditionality is even more narrow because it is focusing on the EU budget, and they cannot really counter many small legislative changes of the Orbán regime and the informal power to drive democratic backsliding. So let me just very briefly have 4 suggestions here what to do. What could be done? First, I think it's important that this type of, instead of creating constantly new tools, political and legal tools, the institutions should learn, EU institutions should learn, finally use this very rich toolkit, which is at the disposal of the EU. If the new conditionality mechanism, for instance, would be difficult to enforce against Hungary because there is lacking political will, maybe the Commission could gather some political will and strength to do it elsewhere, and within the EU treaty it's possible to do this. This common provisions regulation already allows the suspension of EU payments, as many great scholars have highlighted many times, like Daniel Kelemen and Kim Lane-Scheppele, and so on and so forth. So this is again a matter of political will. I think it would be also great if the von der Leyen Commission would demand the Hungarian government to adhere the core values of the EU, and the Commission should employ a lot more targeted legal argument, just like it did with regards to Poland and the Polish judiciary, so that the EU Court of Justice will have more opportunities to interpret the EU treaties. And I think it's also very worrying that the European Commission is not really launching infringement procedures anymore, or at least the level of infringement procedures is heavily dropping, and the Commission should definitely, bring more infringement actions with the application for interim measures related to the Article 7 procedure. With regards to Hungary, more specifically focusing on the press of freedom and media pluralism, and among major concerns, listed under the scope of Article 7 itself. And last but not least, the European Court of Justice should also prioritize these infringement procedures and actions to prevent further harm done by these governments, because what we've seen is that Viktor Orbán has been developing this cat and mouse game, as I just mentioned, that he's benefiting from the long-standing procedures of the EU institutions, and meanwhile, politically, the damage is done. This is exactly what happened to the Central European University, for instance, and this is exactly what is still happening with the NGOs, that before the decision of the Court of Justice is being made, the final decision, the regime can simply hollow out democratic institutions or even force out universities from Hungary.
Yes, thank you. Just shortly, I think this cities initiative enjoys big support in Hungary because after the last elections, municipal elections, quite a big number of cities, big cities and smaller cities, elected opposition politicians as mayors. And these municipalities and cities experience how the government drives their finances, cut off support from them. So EU funding really would make a difference for these cities and regions. What I don't see is apart from the parliament, because Rasmus, you are right, I know the parliament is very much in favor of this kind of support, but I don't see the other institutions, the Commission and the Council have appetite to change the regulation, to change the rules in order to make these cities eligible for direct funding or finances. So I really don't see whether their initiative will be met in the European Union.
Thank you. I can see that there is also a question on the besides of the rule of law mechanism related to the budget and the money flow, if there are other possibilities also to defend the values, the European common European values. And Edith, you mentioned already some important also measures, but also I would mention agencies like, for example, also the European Public Prosecutor's Office, the European Court of Auditors, all these kind of agencies, and we are having in the European Union. And there, of course, there are two things. First of all, we need to have laws so that they can work and they get competences on all of these kind of questions. And then, of course, also we need to found them so that they can act, and that there, for example, is also enough staff to act. And this is, of course, also a very important issue. And I just want to mention it here because in many countries, European bureaucracy is always something very negative and something where everybody thinks that we should cut the budget on these kind of administration, but this means also we are cutting it there, for example, and this is of course also a problem I would like to mention here. I can see, I would like to ask you one question, and maybe we can take this also as a final round and to make an outlook, but the more concrete question, and I will also comment on that, is the question of other countries in the European Union, and if there is pressure from countries like Spain, Portugal, Italy interested in getting money quite fast out of at least the recovery facility because of the economic crisis these countries are in. And I would like to add that we could see, for example, the Portuguese Prime Minister visiting Hungary and before the European Council back in July. And how do you think? How do you see this? Have you also maybe some insights on the discussion also in Poland and Hungary? How are these countries also trying maybe to collaborate with other countries in the European Union? I mean, you mentioned that right now they are quite isolated, and I think this will continue to be very clear there. But on the other side, we can also see political differences in among the other 25 member states or 24 member states, and I would like to hear your comment on that, and then maybe you could come with an outlook. What do you think will happen next week in the European Council? Some of you were quite optimistic at the beginning of our debate, and maybe you could comment on that, and then we will see who of you will be right next after the Council next week. I don't know. Last time we started with Edith and ended with Lucas. Maybe we will start with Lucas now.
I think the situation with the other countries is interesting because one of the features of this agreement in the summer was that nobody was particularly happy, but everybody got like a certain part of what they wanted. Like the North got the rebates and the rule of law. We can discuss what was more important to them. The parliament now got a lot on the rule of law, arguably not so much on other issues. The South would have wanted a lot more grants, and it got a bit less. Like I think it was a typical European compromise, and I think is one of the reasons why we should get it over the line in one piece is that, of course, this is a bit of a fragile construction, and I think nobody should be under the illusion that there's only the money flowing to the hardest hit countries as a priority for the whole union. I think we should be acutely aware that for some countries that's not the biggest priority. Just one thing on timeline, because I think that's important that we keep that in mind. It was never planned that the recovery money would come or would flow before next summer. There can be some retroactive financing of measures that are already taking place now, but like Orban and Morawiecki have not blocked any flow of funds yet. And I think that's also important in like how we discussed this whole thing, that there was always a buffer for this kind of negotiations, and in a way we are still in the plan. And if we get an agreement this week, or even if it takes a bit longer, we can still disperse the funds in the summer when they were planned to be dispersed. Finally, on the European Council, I would say I'm still cautiously optimistic, maybe a bit even more so after what we just heard from Poland. But I guess there's also still a possibility for an accident. But if I had to bet, I would say we get an agreement.
Okay, Katalin and then Edith. Thanks, Lucas.
Thanks, Rasmus. When it comes to other countries, I think there have always been there were always plans and intention in the European Union to divide member states, and it's natural that the Visegrad 4 or Hungary and Poland want to attract the southern countries because they knew that the situation is very severe, economic situation, financial situation is very severe in those countries, and they might support the Hungarian Polish couple to achieve what they want. What is surprising to me so far is that the other countries, the other member states, the 25, are quite united so far in this. So Poland and Hungary have not achieved their aim yet, and hopefully they won't. And this brings me to the next European Council. I share Lucas' view. I am also optimistic. I think that there is always an agreement reached, and hopefully this will be the case this time as well.
Thank you, Katalin. Edith.
I just unmuted myself. Yeah, so maybe on this note, which has been raised by Katalin, and to have a broader look at our region. So when it comes to the Visegrad countries, we have seen like many dividing lines, and more specifically when it comes to money and financial interests, there is very difficult to identify such thing as Visegrad unity, I think. And I think it's also worth taking into account that otherwise, even if they're not sort of on the same page when it comes to the rule of law and what is the support, for instance, towards to set up this rule of law institution, which has been initiated by Poland and Hungary, Czech Republic and Slovakia is not willing to really to join this. I think there are quite many vulnerabilities in this region. So like in general, Central and East Europe has been always serving the role of this early warning system for the West, because there is a very low level of interpersonal trust, very low level of social capital, and very low level of trust within democratic institutions. And this is exactly which is favorable for illiberal and Eurosceptic sort of turn and trends in the region. You know, there were some polls like 15 years ago which were already claiming that these societies are the most skeptic about the state of democracy in general, and I think it's problematic, because this is exactly why it would be very important to do more to inform Central Eastern Europe and our societies, especially Poland and Hungary, about the benefits and the values of the democratic institutions and other key achievements of the transition 30 years ago, because both the Polish and the Hungarian government are abandoning these achievements of the transition, and they're both referring to the failure of this period when they're altering their political system in general.
Okay, thanks to all of you. Thanks, Edith. Thanks, Lucas. Thanks, Katalin, for your insights. I think it was a very interesting discussion. I hope this is also the case for all of the participants. It will be an interesting week and maybe some interesting weeks. I guess we will all follow this quite closely. If you have some more comments or remarks, then please feel free to contact our experts. I guess you will find their contact in the internet, and you can, of course, also always contact me, and then we will stay in touch and continue with the debate, because I think that if there is also, if in the case of an agreement next week, most of the questions we have discussed today will continue. And thanks to all of you, and have a good evening. Good night.